My name is Jacob Fabry, but everyone just calls me Jake. I am, or perhaps was, a civil engineer. For 5 years, my world was a grid of concrete and steel, a symphony of deadlines, and the ceaseless, grinding noise of a city that never slept. I designed foundations for buildings that scraped the sky, structures meant to last a century, yet I felt my own foundation crumbling day by day. The life I had meticulously planned felt like a cage I had built for myself. I was successful, I was stable, and I was profoundly, soul-crushingly miserable. The burnout wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow erosion, a grinding down of my spirit, until all that was left was a hollow ache and the constant hum of anxiety. So I quit. I liquidated my assets, packed a few essentials into my aging Subaru, and drove west, chasing a half-formed idea. A romantic notion born from books and old photographs. I was seeking what the brochures and lifestyle articles call the quintessential Western experience. I wanted silence. I wanted a horizon that wasn't serrated by skyscrapers. I wanted to feel small again, to be an observer of a landscape so vast that my own anxieties would shrink to their proper, insignificant size. I read a quote somewhere that to be a successful lookout, you need to be comfortable in your own skin beforehand, that it's not a place to escape your problems. I dismissed it as gatekeeping. Of course it was an escape. That was the entire point. That's how I found myself applying for a seasonal position as a fire lookout with the U.S. Forest Service. It seemed like the perfect antidote to my former life. The job description itself was a poem of solitude. Live in a small cabin on a mountaintop. Watch the wilderness for smoke. Be a guardian of the forest. I read about the history, the legacy of these lonely sentinels, and felt a pull I couldn't ignore. It was, I told myself, a way to reconnect with something real and tangible after years of living in the abstract world of blueprints and stress projections. Some part of me knew I was running, but I convinced myself I was running towards something, not just away from the noise. I was seeking a life-changing experience, a hard reset for a soul worn smooth by the relentless friction of modern life. I got the job. My post was a tower on a place called Pinyon Peak, a remote summit deep within the sprawling green expanse of the Nez Perce, Clearwater National Forest in Idaho. The name itself felt like a good omen, a link to the land's deep history, a place where the memory of the Nez Perce people was etched into the very mountains and rivers. This, I thought, was where I could finally find some peace. This was where the world would go quiet. The journey to the tower was a gradual shedding of the world I knew. The interstate gave way to a state highway, then to a paved county road, and finally to a winding, rutted dirt track that climbed relentlessly into the mountains. My Subaru, a veteran of city potholes, protested the abuse, but I pushed it onward. The air grew thin and sharp, scented with pine and damp earth. For the last 2 miles, the road was impassable. I parked the car, shouldered my pack, and began the final ascent on foot. When I first saw it, it took my breath away. Pinyon Peak Lookout was a perfect icon of the wilderness. A 14 by 14 foot wooden cab. A box of windows perched atop a 40-foot steel tower a lone sentinel watching over an ocean of trees. It was, as one lookout described her own tower, a glass house on top of a mountain, a place of total exposure and unparalleled perspective. The forest below wasn't just a collection of trees. It felt like a single, living entity, ancient and breathing. The sheer scale of it was humbling. The peaks and valleys rolled away in every direction, fading into a hazy blue infinity. This was a land that held its own stories, a place where the veil between the physical and the spiritual felt thin. I felt a profound sense of rightness, a conviction that I had made the correct choice. The first week was idyllic. I fell into the rhythm of the lookout's life, a routine that appealed to the engineer in me. The job was one of meticulous observation, a litany of small, crucial tasks. I would wake with the sun, the 360-degree windows leaving no room for shades or sleeping in. After a breakfast cooked on the small propane stove, I'd clock in on the radio at 9:30 a.m. My world was governed by a simple, vital mandate every 15 to 20 minutes. I was to perform a complete scan of my territory with my binoculars. The heart of the tower and of my job was the Osborne Fire Finder. It was a beautiful piece of antiquated technology, a circular map of my region overlaid with a rotating brass ring and 2 sighting mechanisms. It was a tool of pure logic. Spot a smoke, align the front and rear sights, and read the azimuth, the directional bearing, from the ring. With that single piece of data, I could pinpoint a potential disaster on the map and radio the location to dispatch. It was a way of imposing a grid of human order onto the beautiful chaos of the wilderness. I loved its precision. Twice a day, at 10:30 a.m. and 30:30 p.m., I'd copy down the weather broadcast from Central Dispatch. At 6:00 p.m., I'd clock out. The days were long, quiet, and filled with a profound sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I read, I wrote in a journal. I watched eagles ride the thermals. The silence was a balm. The first whisper of wrongness came on my 8th day. It was a clear, hot afternoon. The air was thick with heat haze, the distant ridges shimmering as if seen through water. I was in the middle of a routine scan, my binoculars sweeping methodically from left to right. My gaze passed over a deep, trackless canyon to the northeast. I swung back. For a split second, framed perfectly in the crosshairs of the fire finder, I saw it, a thin, gray plume of smoke rising straight up in the still air. My heart hammered. Adrenaline, pure and sharp, flooded my system. This was it. The real thing. I noted the azimuth, my hands surprisingly steady, and consulted the map. Section 12, Township 38 North, Range 5 East. A nasty, inaccessible spot. I looked up from the map, back through the sights to confirm the visual before making the call. It was gone. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. I scanned the entire canyon again, inch by painstaking inch. Nothing. Just the endless green canopy and the shimmering heat. It couldn't have dissipated that fast. A fire doesn't just vanish. I spent the next hour watching that spot, my gut churning. Finally, I wrote it off. A trick of the light. A dust devil. The heat playing with my eyes. I made a note in my official log. Foul smoke, possible heat shimmer. Sector NE. But the explanation felt thin an excuse I was telling myself. That night, the silence I had come to cherish felt different. It felt heavier, pressed against the glass of the cab. As I lay on my cot, drifting towards sleep, I heard a sound from outside. A faint, intermittent scratching. It sounded like it was coming from the catwalk just outside the door. Scrabble, scratch, scratch. I sat up, listening. The sound was delicate, almost furtive. My mind immediately went to the wildlife I'd seen. There were picas and chipmunks everywhere, tiny thieves, who would try to make off with anything not nailed down. It was probably just one of them, its claws making noise on the metal grating of the catwalk. I lay back down, pulling the blanket up to my chin. It's just an animal, I told myself. You're in their world now. You have to get used to their noises. But as I stared up at the ceiling, listening to the wind sigh around the corners of my glass house, a new feeling began to creep in, cold and unwelcome. It was the first prickle of a fear I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the fear of loneliness which I had craved. It was the fear of not being alone at all. The rational part of my brain, the engineer, had logged the day's events as explainable phenomena. But another, older part of my mind wasn't so sure. It looked out into the vast, indifferent darkness of the Idaho wilderness and wondered, what, exactly, was looking back? The unsettling feeling from that first night lingered like the morning fog in the valleys below. For a few days, life returned to its peaceful, monotonous rhythm. I performed my scans, logged the weather, and tried to convince myself that the false smoke and the scratching had been products of an overactive imagination, a city mind struggling to adapt to the profound silence. But the wilderness wasn't silent anymore. It was listening. The anomalies began to accumulate, small tears in the fabric of my orderly world. One morning, I found my heavy hand axe, which I always kept propped just inside the cab door, lying on the ground 40 feet below, nestled in the dirt at the base of the tower's steel legs. There was no wind that night strong enough to blow it out the door and over the railing. I had to make the long climb down and back up to retrieve it, my eyes scanning the tree line the entire time. I told myself I must have left it on the catwalk by mistake, and it had vibrated off. A flimsy explanation, but better than the alternative. The scratching sound returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the faint skittering of a small animal. This was louder, more deliberate. It was the sound of something being dragged slowly across the glass of the windows. A rhythmic, grating scrape that set my teeth on edge. It always came from the side of the tower, facing away from the moon, from the deepest darkness. The first time I heard it, I burst out of the cab with a powerful flashlight, heart pounding, but the catwalk was empty. There was nothing there. Then came the light. It was well after midnight. The sky a star, dusted velvet sheet. I couldn't sleep. I was scanning the horizon with my binoculars, more out of nervous habit than professional duty. And I saw it. A single point of light, like an old-fashioned lantern, moving slowly through the trees in a part of the forest the maps showed as trackless, rugged wilderness. It wasn't a hiker's headlamp. It was too steady, its glow too soft and yellow. It moved without bobbing, gliding through the dense undergrowth, where no trail existed. I watched it for nearly an hour, until it simply winked out. The next morning, I reported it. The voice on the other end of the radio was polite, but I could hear the skepticism. "We'll keep an eye on it, Pinyon Peak. Probably just some campers who went off trail. They found nothing." Of course they didn't. My sanctuary, my glass house on the mountain, was beginning to feel like a display case. The 360-degree views that had once felt so liberating now felt like a constant, unblinking state of exposure. I started to feel watched. It was a primal, physical sensation, the kind of feeling that makes the hair on your arms stand up. I was being observed, and whatever was observing me was patient. The discovery happened on a Tuesday. The air was thick with the smell of rain, and I was doing a deep clean of the cab. An engineer's attempt to impose order on a world that was rapidly losing its sense. While sweeping under the cot, I noticed one of the floorboards was slightly loose. Curiosity piqued, I pried at it with my fingers. It came up easily. Tucked into the dusty space below was a small, oilskin-wrapped package. My hands trembled slightly as I unwrapped it. Inside was a slim, leather bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The first page had a name written in faded ink. Harvey Miller, Lookout, 1996. Finding a predecessor's log wasn't unusual, but this was clearly a private journal, not an official one. I sat on the cot and began to read. For the first several entries, Harvey's experience mirrored my own. He wrote of the profound beauty, the quiet majesty of the place, the satisfaction of the work. He documented the weather, the wildlife, the simple joys of solitude. Then, about 2 weeks into his season, the tone began to shift. He wrote about a strange plume of smoke that vanished. He wrote about scratching sounds on the glass. He wrote about seeing alone, inexplicable light moving through the trees at night. My blood ran cold. I was reading my own experiences, written down by a man 2 decades before I'd ever set foot here. The journal became more frantic, the handwriting more jagged. Harvey wrote of waking in the dead of night to see a woman standing at the edge of the tree line, just watching him. A woman with a smile that was too wide, too fixed. He wrote of seeing a cougar near the tower, but one that was unnaturally large and black as pitch, its eyes glowing in the dark. And then he gave it a name. A name he'd learned from an old Nez Perce man, a seasonal ranger who had visited him once and, seeing the fear in Harvey's eyes, had shared a piece of forbidden lore. The Pumwa, according to the old man's story, which Harvey had transcribed in painstaking detail. The Pumwa was a witch, a shapeshifter. She was one of the first peoples, a daughter of the trickster, creator Coyote himself. But she had been banished from her people for a terrible crime, helping another witch hoard the life, giving salmon, disrupting the balance of the world. Her father, Coyote, in his anger, exiled her to the deep canyons of the Snake and Salmon Rivers to live among the cave peoples. There, she learned a dark and terrible magic, a way to achieve a twisted form of immortality. To sustain her unnaturally long life, She needed to make sacrifices. She needed to lure people into the wilderness, into her domain. Especially during times of chaos, like storms and wildfires, which she could influence with her magic. I stared at the words, my mind reeling. It was insane. The stuff of campfire tales, but it explained everything. I flipped through the last few pages of the journal, which were filled with short, desperate entries. They read like a set of rules for survival. On July 12th, he wrote of rhythmic scratching on the west, facing glass, noting it was too deliberate for an animal. A few days later, an entry from 2 a.m. Rid. Woke to see a woman standing at the tree line. Just standing, smiling. Turned on the main light, she was gone. On July 21st, he saw the big cat again, describing it as cougar, but black as pitch and twice the size of any I've seen. It watched the tower. By August 3rd, the terror was palpable. He wrote of hearing a woman humming through radio static, even when dispatch confirmed the channel was clear. It's the Pumwa, he wrote. The old man was right. The final entry, dated August 4th, was a chilling, self-directed command. She knows I'm here. She wants me to run. Rule 1, don't run. Never run. The journal ended there. There were no more entries. I sat in the silent cab, the weight of Harvey's story pressing down on me. I was no longer just a man struggling with isolation. I was the next chapter in a story that had been playing out on this mountain for years, perhaps centuries. I wasn't going crazy. The threat was real. As if on cue, a voice from below shattered the silence. Hello. Is anyone up there? I nearly jumped out of my skin. I scrambled to the window and looked down. At the base of the tower stood a young woman. She was dressed in hiking gear, with a large rucksack on her back. She had dark hair and a kind face. She looked like a silent native girl, maybe in her late teens or early 20s. Exactly as one of Harvey's contacts had described the Pumwa's human form. I think I'm lost, she called up, her voice pleasant. My GPS died. Could I get some water and maybe look at your map? My mind was a battlefield. Every instinct of human decency, every protocol of my job, screamed at me to help her. She looked harmless, exhausted. But Harvey's words echoed in my head. A woman, smiling. She looked up at me and smiled. It was a perfect, friendly smile, but seeing it after reading the journal, it felt like a mask stretched over something horrible. This was a test. It was a sophisticated, cruel trap, preying on my empathy. My refusal to help would feel like a monstrous act, yet helping her could be my last. I can't let you up. I called down, my voice hoarse. It's against regulations, but I can lower some water to you. Oh, she said, her smile not faltering. Okay. Thank you. My hands shook as I tied a full water bottle to my rope and lowered it down the side of the tower. It swung gently, landing on the ground a few feet from her. She watched it land. She looked up at me, her dark eyes unreadable. That terrible, fixed smile was still on her face. Then, without a word, she turned and walked back into the dense forest, disappearing into the shadows as if she were made of them. She never touched the water. I stood at the window for a long time, watching the untouched water bottle, swinging gently in the wind. a pendulum marking the seconds of my new, terrifying reality. The choice had been made for me. I was no longer just a lookout. I was a prisoner. The encounter with the woman, with the pomois, shattered the last remnants of my denial. The world was no longer divided into the rational and the irrational. There was only the horrifying truth of my situation. I was trapped 40 feet in the air, a solitary man in a glass box, being stalked by a creature from the darkest corners of Nez Perce legend. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into a watching shape. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. I clutched Harvey's journal like a holy text, rereading his desperate rules, trying to graft his experience onto my own. The sky began to reflect my inner turmoil. The clear blue Idaho sky I had come to love was swallowed by a bruised purple, gray mass of clouds rolling in from the west. Dispatch had been forecasting it all day, a major electrical storm system moving through the region. In my previous life, I would have found it beautiful. Now I knew it was a harbinger. The pomois was associated with storms. She didn't just appear in them, she used them. The storm wasn't just weather, it was an accomplice. As dusk fell, the first rumbles of thunder echoed through the canyons. The tower, my tiny metal and wood sanctuary, began to feel like the most dangerous place on Earth. I thought of the thick copper, grounding cables I'd inspected during my first week. Cables that snaked from the roof down, the steel legs and into the earth, designed to safely disperse a lightning strike. Now they felt like an invitation, a direct line from the storm's fury to me. I was sitting in a tiny metal box, on the highest point for miles, literally daring the lightning to strike. I was a beacon. The storm broke with a savage intensity. Rain hammered against the windows in horizontal sheets, and the wind howled with a freight train's fury. Lightning spider-webbed across the sky, each flash bleaching the world white for a split second, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the tower to its foundations. In those brief, brilliant flashes, I saw the forest below, a writhing, tormented landscape. And then the siege began. It started with the scratching, not the faint skittering of a pica or the deliberate scrape I'd heard before. This was a frantic, violent clawing at the glass, a sound like a bag of razors being dragged loud across the panes, loud enough to be heard, even over the roar of the storm. It moved from window to window, a circling, relentless assault. I huddled in the center of the room, away from the glass, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then came a deep, resonant THD from below, the sound of something heavy striking one of the tower's steel legs. It was followed by another and another, a percussive rhythm of pure malice. It was trying to shake me out, to test the integrity of my cage. A flash of lightning illuminated the catwalk, and my heart stopped. A face was pressed against the glass of the door. It was the hiker girl. Her eyes were wide and black, her smile stretched into a grotesque, inhuman grin. Her face was pale and slick with rain, and for a horrifying instant, the lightning seemed to show what was beneath the skin. A flicker of sharp teeth and hollowed out features, a monstrous death mask. I screamed, stumbling backward and falling over my chair. Before I could even process what I'd seen, a new sound began, the one I had been dreading most of all. A slow metallic clang. 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 It was climbing the stairs. The sound was heavy, deliberate. Not the white tread of a human, but the weighty impact of something powerful and determined. Its claws, or whatever it had, scraping against the metal steps with each upward movement. It was coming for me. The sanctity of my tower, my last refuge, was being violated. The verticality of the ascent was a unique form of terror. The threat was rising from the chaos below to claim my small bubble of order. Clang. Clang. Sealang. It was getting faster, closer. It was halfway up. 3/4. Panic seized me, a cold, paralyzing wave. My mind was a blank wall of terror. Then, a single thought broke through. A line from Harvey's journal. Rule 30. She hates the main light. With a surge of desperate energy, I scrambled to my feet and lunged for the main switch by the door. It controlled the powerful exterior floodlights that illuminated the catwalk. I slammed my palm against it. 4 brilliant beams of light cut through the darkness, flooding the tower's exterior in a harsh, artificial glare. The climbing stopped instantly. Silence, save for the drumming of the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. I held my breath. My ear pressed against the door. Nothing. Cautiously, I crept to the window next to the door, the one where her face had been, and peered down at the staircase. My breath hitched in my throat. Crouched on the landing just below the trapdoor. Entrance to the cab was not a woman. It was a cougar. But it was a creature of nightmare. It was huge, far larger than any mountain lion I had ever seen pictures of. And its fur was the color of pitch, a void in the rain, soaked night. Its muscles bunched powerfully. And as it turned its head to look up, its eyes caught the floodlight and glowed with a sickening yellow, green fire. As I watched, frozen in horror, the air around it seemed to shimmer, to warp like heat haze. The creature's form began to flow and twist, the sleek, feline body elongated, the powerful limbs contorted. The black fur seemed to melt away, resolving into the pale skin and dark, wet clothes of the hiker girl. The transformation was fluid and sickeningly silent. She stood there on the landing, smiling that same terrible smile, the shapeshift confirmed. The last shred of doubt incinerated in a flash of pure horror. She was both things at once, the beautiful lure and the ravenous predator. She held my gaze for a long moment, then turned and descended the stairs, with an unnerving, graceful silence. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the floor, an axe in my hands, watching the storm slowly die down. The adrenaline gave way to a bone, deep exhaustion. But sleep was an impossible luxury. Just before dawn, as the sky was beginning to soften to a bruised gray, the radio crackled to life. It wasn't the familiar, tinny voice of dispatch. It was a woman's voice. Soft, melodic, and deeply unsettling. Jake. It whispered from the speaker. A sound that seemed to bypass my ears and slide directly into my brain. I know you're alone up there, Jake. Don't be afraid. It was her voice. The hiker, the Pumwa. It was using my lifeline, my only connection to the outside world, as a weapon. It's so cold out here, the voice cooed, a perfect imitation of human empathy. Calm down. Let me in. I can help you escape all this. I can make the fear go away. The entity could mimic human speech, a detail no folklore had prepared me for. It was a violation so profound, so intimate, that something inside me snapped. With a guttural roar of rage and terror, I lunged at the radio, grabbing it and smashing it against the corner of my metal desk again and again. Plastic shattered. Wires sparked. I didn't stop until it was a mangled wreck of circuits and broken casing. I threw the ruined device into the corner and collapsed against the wall, my chest heaving. The silence that filled the cab was absolute. It was a silence of my own making. I had severed my last tie to the world. No one could call me. I could call no one. The process of isolation the creature had begun was now complete, and I was its architect. I was utterly, terrifyingly, and irrevocably alone. I survived the night. Survival, however, felt less like a victory and more like a temporary stay of execution. As the sun rose, it did not bring the clear, hopeful light of a new day. Instead, the dawn was a sickening, angry red, painting the eastern sky in hues of blood and fire. The air, thick and heavy after the storm, carried a new scent, the sharp, acrid smell of burning pine. I raised my binoculars to my aching eyes, my hands trembling so badly it was difficult to focus. And then I saw it. My blood turned to ice in my veins. A few miles to the northeast, in the exact same trackless canyon where I had seen the phantom light days before, a column of thick, black smoke was churning into the sky. It wasn't a wisp. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a fire, a significant, growing wildfire. And I knew with a certainty that transcended logic and settled deep in my bones that she had started it. The Pumwa's connection to fire wasn't just folklore, it was a fact I was now witnessing firsthand. The storm had been the overture. This was the main act. The fire presented me with a paralyzing, impossible choice. My entire purpose for being on this mountain, the very reason for my existence in this last box, was to spot and report fires. It was my one and only job, my duty, ingrained in me by training and by my own engineering. Bred sense of responsibility screamed at me to act. I had a backup handheld radio. I could get on the horn, call it in, give them the coordinates from the Osborne Fire Funder, and be the calm, professional lookout. But Harvey's journal and the monstrous reality of the previous night told me it was a trap. The fire wasn't a natural disaster. It was a lure. It was a piece of bait cast with terrifying intelligence. I understood its horrifying purpose now. The fire was designed to do one of two things. Either it would force me, its primary target, out of the relative safety of the tower and into the woods where she was waiting, or, even more monstrously, it would lure firefighters into the wilderness. It would bring her a fresh harvest of victims, souls to sacrifice to sustain her unnatural life. I was caught in a perfect, diabolical machine. To do my job was to become an accomplice to murder. To remain silent was to betray my duty and let a massive fire rage unchecked through a national forest. The tools of my trade, the fire fender and the radio, which had once represented order and safety, now felt like instruments of damnation. Using them would be a capitulation, an act of feeding the beast. I stood before the fire finder, its brass ring gleaming in the red, tinned light. I could see the fire through its sights, a roiling, living thing. The smoke, as it billowed upwards, seemed to twist into unnatural shapes. For a moment, it looked like a vast, grasping hand reaching for the sky. The Pumwa had inverted the very purpose of my existence here. The fire lookout system was created to impose human order on the chaos of the wilderness. She was using that very system, that very logic against itself. She had created the disaster, and now she was waiting for the system's response, turning a tool of preservation into a beacon for slaughter. My choice wasn't just about my own life. It was about whether to activate the trap. As the morning wore on, the fire grew with terrifying speed, cresting a nearby ridge. The roar was a distant, constant hum, and the heat was a palpable presence on the air. I could not stay. The fire would eventually reach the tower, or she would return, emboldened, to finish what she started. I couldn't call for help, because that would mean leading others into this nightmare. My only option was to run. It was a desperate, suicidal gamble, but it was the only choice that didn't make me her accomplice. My movements were stiff, robotic. I shoved Harvey's journal into my pack. I filled my canteen with the last of my water. I grabbed the small hand axe from the floor. I took one last, sweeping look around the 14 by 14-foot cab that had been my entire world. My sanctuary, my prison, my tomb. Then, with a final, shuddering breath, I unbolted the trapdoor in the floor, swung my legs through the opening, and began my descent. Each step down the metal staircase was a conscious act of will. I was leaving my fortress and walking directly into her territory. The air grew thick with smoke, stinging my eyes and clogging my throat. The world below was an apocalyptic canvas of red light and shifting gray shadows. I knew she was out there, in the smoky wilderness, waiting for me. Perhaps my desperate flight could serve one last, tragic purpose to lead her away, to make myself the sole focus of her hunt, and to give any potential rescue crews a fighting chance. It was a sliver of hope, but it was all I had. I reached the bottom, my feet touching the soft earth, and without looking back, I ran,